Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. After months of hearings and deliberation, Lord Leveson's inquiry into press standards has reported. He recommends the government pass a new law setting up a press watchdog, and we'll be talking about that later in the programme. But to start with, let's look at what Lord Leveson's inquiry said about the power of the press to determine public opinion over women, minorities, including immigrants and refugees, asylum seekers and Muslims. Leveson recommended that a new regulator should accept complaints from third parties, making it possible to take action on stories that do not concern you individually. Such stories as about the Muslim community as a whole, for instance. The tabloid press has been exposed on several occasions for making up stories that campaigners argue are hostile to Muslims. So will the Leveson report help put a stop to such prejudice in the press? Before we discuss the question, let's take a little look at the background.
It was the culmination of 16 months of detailed investigation. Victims of the phone hacking scandal that triggered the inquiry were hoping it would be the moment the British press was finally made to clean up its act. Lord Justice Leveson delivered his verdict last Thursday. The press should be accountable to an independent regulatory body, he said, with laws in place to make sure the regulator is doing its job properly. But his recommendations have not been without controversy. While his findings were welcomed by phone hacking victims and campaigners for media accountability, others have expressed concerns about what they see as the first step towards state control of the media. Leveson insisted this was not the case.
This is not and cannot reasonably or fairly be characterised as statutory regulation of the press. I am proposing independent regulation of the press organised by the press itself, with a statutory process to support press freedom, provide stability and guarantee for the public that this new body is independent and effective.
But Prime Minister David Cameron said he was worried about the idea that Parliament should set up the watchdog, saying this could damage press freedom.
I'm not convinced at this stage that statute is necessary to achieve Lord Justice Leveson's objectives. I believe there may be alternative options for putting in place incentives, providing reassurance to the public and ensuring the Leveson principles of regulation are put in place, and these options should be explored.
Cameron's reaction to the Leveson inquiry has been met with dismay by many, with some suggesting he's trying to stay cosy with the country's big newspapers. In protest at Cameron's response, more than 120,000 people have signed a petition started by the campaign group Hacked Off, demanding that Leveson's recommendations be implemented in full. And in an unprecedented move, Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg publicly denounced Cameron's position.
Changing the law is the only way to give us all the assurance that the new regulator isn't just independent for a few months or years, but is independent for good.
What has received less media attention than the coalition's public split are the concerns raised by Leveson about press coverage of women and minority groups, including immigrants, refugees and asylum seekers and Muslims, which he says should be a priority for the new regulator. Leveson wants to allow complaints to be made against the press by third parties, which would make it easier for action to be taken against newspapers accused of Islamophobia. So what now? David Cameron has ordered the government to draft new press laws, just as Leveson advised, but only to try to convince the Lib Dems and Labour that they're a bad idea. Whether Leveson's long-awaited recommendations will actually make it into practice remains to be seen. Emily Churchill, Islam Channel.
Well, joining me to discuss the Leveson report are Brian Cathcart from the Hacked Off campaign and Richard Peppiatt, who quit the Daily Star in protest at Islamophobic stories. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Richard, you gave evidence to the inquiry, and Lord Justice Leveson quotes it. Particularly, I think, the story you were personally involved in. So just to give you a sense of what's been going on in the newsrooms and what, in particular on this subject at any rate, Leveson was looking at, just tell us what it was that happened with you.
I mean, the Daily Star is obviously a right-wing tabloid, and it certainly felt to me that increasingly they were sort of pushing a very anti-Islam stance, and often that included sort of manipulating the facts or ignoring facts, as it may be, to sort of create stories that sort of were Muslim bashing, and it got to the point where, for me, it was certainly as if they were starting to support the English Defence League quite openly, sort of editorials that were quite complimentary, and that was sort of, it's the phrase that's being thrown around a lot, crossing the Rubicon. Well, that for me was crossing the Rubicon of my tabloid career, and I decided to resign publicly, and the Guardian printed my letter.
And Leveson's report actually goes through a series of entirely invented stories, about asylum seekers eating donkeys that have been taken out of Greenwich Royal Park. I mean, I suppose most people, if they stop for a second to reflect on those kind of headlines, will have some reservations. But at the moment they're printed, they are passed off as fact.
Well, yeah, I think that's part of the issue. It doesn't just remain within that newspaper. Often it passes into TV, radio discussion shows. So it's not fair just to isolate it and say it's just in a tabloid. No one believes them anyway, because it does sort of pass into the general consciousness. It's discussed on the school gates, and I think that's something that often the defenders, if you'd like to call them, of the tabloids don't like to admit, is that you can't just say, these are entertainment products. They are what they are, because they do spread throughout our culture and throughout our national discourse.
Brian, the Leveson report says that when it's dealing with this issue, that the Star gave them a sort of lever arch file of more positive stories. How do you think that works? What's the effect of those two different kinds of stories?
Well, I just don't think it's an argument to say that okay, I've got this wrong, but I got this right. I mean, we don't forgive the bank robber who also happens to give money to charity. And that's just not the way the world works. And I think there's been quite a lot of that in the special pleading by the press, both before Leveson, in evidence to him, and since, in which they've made this propaganda drive over the past couple of months to suggest that everything was fine in the press. There'd been some problems, but they'd been sorted out. Leave it to us, as it were. We know what's best. That sort of shallow argument has dominated, and I simply don't think the public buys it.
Tell us a little bit about the petition that you started, because that's a phenomenal figure that was mentioned in the report, 120,000 signatures.
Yes, 130,000 now, even as we sit here. Indeed, it's please go hackinginquiry.org and sign. It's a petition to call for the implementation of Lord Justice Leveson's recommendations on press regulation, and we are hoping, to get big numbers. We were amazed at how fast it took off. There is, we know, a very strong public commitment to this. As I say, the press campaign hasn't worked. We know from opinion polls, we know from the support we receive generally, that the public is very angry. And indeed, MPs are very angry about the way the press has behaved in the past few years. And there is a determination to see change this time, despite what Mr. Cameron suggests.
Richard, one of the things that Leveson doesn't talk about when he's talking about the press's attitude towards minorities, and ethnic minorities and asylum seekers and so forth, is the atmosphere into which the story is released. And I guess, if you're trying to calibrate the effect of that lever arch file of supposedly positive stories and the effect of those stories, maybe it's beyond Leveson, but I mean, that's a vital question, isn't it? If you release this into an atmosphere that already has, as you say, the EDL in it, it has a different effect.
Yeah, it does. And I think there's a lot of good work that is done by community groups to try and bring sort of Muslim and other, other religions together in communities and get some cohesion. And for newspapers to sometimes claw at that, to try and sort of create a bit of tension, a bit of emotive stories to sell papers, it's a pretty grubby way to make a profit, I suppose. And the interesting thing is, for me, is that often you have the sort of the special pleadings say, well, a lot of what's gone wrong with the press is illegal. This is all, hacking's breaking the law. And I think that the treatment of minorities in certain sections of the press is a great example of something which we're not talking about illegality here. We're talking, for the most part, about stuff that's just unethical. It's just not journalistic. And I think that, it doesn't quite fit within their argument to say, well, all this is covered by the law. Well, currently, for many years now, there's been a real problem with how do Muslims or any other religion get redress when they feel that they're demonised just for their beliefs.
Brian, we were talking in the intro there about the possibility if Leveson's proposals are actually implemented, which would allow you to make a complaint about the kind of abuse of a community rather than about an individual. Do you think that's going to have an impact on the kind of problem that Richard just outlined?
I think it can. I think it would be a mistake to assume that it will always be easy. I think any regulator will have to tread carefully in the third-party complaint zone. And I've never understood why they're called third-party. It's if you're not the person affected directly, then you may have a right to complain simply because you feel there's something wrong here, or because you are being tainted by association in some way by this sort of thing.
It's slightly surprising that it must be slightly surprising to people to hear that hasn't already been the case.
Indeed. And the Press Complaints Commission, the utterly discredited Press Complaints Commission, had, if not quite a rule, a practice of simply ignoring. So, for example, in cases of absolutely appalling abuse of individuals, if that individual felt that they didn't want to take on the papers because it would just make it worse, nobody else could take on the papers. Nobody else could say, look, this is wrong, you have to stop it. Please stop it. There was simply no mechanism. And I think that at the same time, I think it's never going to be that widespread or relaxed about third-party complaints, but I think that having the option of accepting the third-party complaints where you know that there is a public interest in addressing the issue, I think is vital, and would have, if the Press Complaints Commission had done it, would have prevented a great many of the worst excesses we've seen, or at least damped them down.
Richard, do you think in the newsroom, do you think among editors that if that power existed, that would make them more cautious about running sort of generic stories?
It all depends what the punishment at the end of it is, really. I mean, at the moment you've got a situation where everyone knows the sheriff in town's got a plastic gun. So who cares if you get a slap on the wrist? And I think that it's all dependent on, okay, if we print this story, what happens to us then? Do we have to print a 2-line apology 6 months later? Or is this going to be a speedy turnaround where it's going to be like-for-like size? Is there going to be a financial penalty involved or some other sort of penalty? I mean, these are sort of the questions which certainly in the next couple of weeks, when the industry are obviously meeting up, and they're going to try as much as possible to play down any talk of fines and like-for-like retractions and all these sorts of punishments, which make sense to any sensible person. They're going to try and sort of remove, I believe, from any sort of new regulation. So, obviously they'd like to carry on as per normal, which is we do what we want and the punishment doesn't fit the crime.
Do you think that would have an effect, Brian? I mean, my view of it, I mean, I've worked in the press a little bit, but my view of it would be that as much as the money, although the money is obviously always important, it would be a like-for-like side, certainly in the printed press, that would begin to jangle nerves in the newsroom.
That would certainly horrify a lot of editors. Particularly the front page option would be absolutely terrifying to them. But I think, Richard puts his finger on what is really the nub of the argument here, which is that editors are used to having it their own way, and proprietors. And in order for there to be change, they have to be accountable to somebody else, and that somebody else has to have clout, has to have power. And the essence of the Leveson recommendations, the thing he says is essential, is to establish that this body that is being created is independent of them and has some authority, so that they are genuinely answerable to somebody else. They have to be forced into that position, he thinks, by having something that is going to be properly monitored by independent monitors to establish that it's viable. It's not like the old Press Complaints Commission. It's doing its job properly. And if you take away, as David Cameron suggests, the ability to check on the Press Complaints Commission too, as it were, if you take that away, then it will slip back into the old ways, just straight away. It will be the poodle of the editors. So, implementation of Leveson, the essential bit that David Cameron wants to rule out, is essential if we want change.
Do you think there's a problem here, Richard, with a sort of wider culture? Because Leveson, in a way, uncovered more than it probably meant to, and we got this picture of of the press magnates slapping the back of the politicians, or the politicians and the press magnates slapping the back of the chief police officers, and on and on and on. Do you think there's a kind of insular kind of political culture among the sort of?
I think that is probably one of the hugest, the biggest thing that's come out of Leveson is this realisation that the press traditionally, they're supposed to hold power to account. But what we've seen is actually there's a power structure where the press are part of that authority, part of that power. So who's looking in on them? The vested interest is so clear. These people drink together, eat together, have Christmas dinners together. Are the press really holding power to account, or are they actually protecting that power? And I think that's an interesting question that's been raised.
And there's a story over the weekend, I think, in the Telegraph, of Lord Leveson himself being off to dinner with Elizabeth Murdoch. Now, this looks to outsiders like there's a very strong club element to this. Do you think?
Well, I think there have been all sorts of attempts to suggest that Lord Justice Leveson is in somebody's pocket. I think the public has very little patience with that. What do we want? We want a judge who's trustworthy, who knows right from wrong. As far as I can see, that's what that's how he operated. He seems to have been very fair. He gave the press endless hearings in his inquiry. Editors came back and talked to him again. They submitted mountains of documents. They could not claim not to have been heard, and I think his findings are judicious, balanced, careful, in many ways generous to the press. They're being allowed to regulate themselves, provided their own regulator meets basic standards for any regulator. And, almost anybody in society nowadays is used to a regulator of some kind, broadcasters in particular. But minicab drivers and nightclub bouncers, doctors and lawyers, people are used to the idea of regulation. They're not accustomed to the idea that you might be able to regulate yourself.
Do you think the debate that's taking place, Richard, they seem to have been quite successful in pinning the idea that this is state regulation on the Leveson inquiry, but I mean that's stretching the definition a bit, isn't it? Because that gives you the impression that the Secretary of State somewhere is they're blacking out in a sort of almost de-notice type way, but we're a long way from that.
This is the irony of it is this sort of reframing of arguments to give yourself favourable terms is one of the reasons that we need Leveson in the first place. It's the idea that because they have such a big megaphone, they are able to shout so loud that this is what we're actually arguing about, be it about immigration, be it about drug law, justice, whatever it may be. They will often reframe the argument through their commentators in terms favourable to themselves. And that's exactly what they did with Leveson. It's become an issue between a free press or Zimbabwe or Stalinist Russia. And no one has ever suggested I've not seen a single person, I'm sure that Brian would agree, not a single person has even mentioned state regulation. I certainly would not be supporting that, and I don't think anyone would. The whole idea of free speech to me has been hijacked by the vested interest groups. The idea that we have a free press, we don't. We have a press that is controlled by a few media barons who control the output through a sort of a backstop way. They're not there on the newsroom floor, but it is controlled. If you look at all the Murdoch papers around the world, 160, 170 of them all supported the Iraq war. That's not the actions of a free press. That's the action of a press that knows that it does the bidding of its owner. And so I think that's one of the concepts that has been hijacked, and that I do find irritating that a free press is what we claim to have at the moment. I don't think we do.
Do you think we're going to get past that? I mean, Michael Foot, when he wrote for the Beaverbrook Press, was famously asked, do you have in mind, Michael, an audience when you're writing? He said, yes, one old man at the top of the building. Do you think we're going to get past that?
Well, I think of it more in terms of journalists being asking themselves more questions. I think we've got into a position where journalists are not really responsible for what they write. Editors won't take responsibility either. We saw a parade of them at Leveson. They just deny everything or forget everything. So nobody's responsible. And what we want to get into, the position we need to get into, is where journalists who may be about to cause harm to somebody say, well, can I justify that? Are there, against any sort of standard measure, can I really justify hurting this person or damaging their reputation? And if you can, if it serves a purpose, if you're exposing wrongdoing, fire away. If you can't, don't do it. And I think that sort of check in the newsroom of people stopping to think is really the thing that's going to make the biggest difference. And I think it could make the biggest difference in Islamophobia too.
OK, well, we've only got 60 seconds left, so let me just get your reactions to the question we're moving on to in the second half of the programme. Will the Leveson report get past the political class? Will it get implemented?
I think it can. I think there is, first of all, still room to change David Cameron's mind, unlikely as that may seem. And I also think we have to recognise that the parliamentary arithmetic is not in favour of David Cameron on this. OK,
Richard, what do you reckon?
I think Brian's spot on. I think that, arithmetic-wise, if it comes to a free vote, we could well see Leveson being implemented in full. That is if we can keep Nick Clegg and Ed Miliband on task and forcing that through.
Okay. Well, that's about all that we've got time for in this half of the programme, but we will be coming back to the same issue in the second half, and we'll be looking at the political prospects for the implementation of the Leveson inquiry.